Happy Sabbath, church. I just want to say thank you for that wonderful special music. I don't know if you guys heard the piano playing and just the vocal arrangement. It really goes to show that God is so talented to give talent to people like you, so thank you. As you were singing, and I'm kind of going off script here, but as you were singing, that song actually means a lot to me. That was one of my auntie's favorite songs, auntie of mine that passed away at a very young age. And when I was going through grief, that song helped me through. And so I was sitting there, and if I look like I was crying or like if I was serious, it's because I was really feeling the song. It's not that I'm upset, but I was really feeling the song because the song title is More Than Words. And sometimes, as we can all attest, that our experience with God cannot be expressed in words. And that's the wonderful part of Jesus, the wonderful part of our Savior, the wonderful part of this theme of saving grace in Christ. And so today we're going to get right into it. The title of my sermon is called Beyond the Borders of Fear. Beyond the Borders of Fear. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who participated. Thank you to those who read the text. Our text can be found specifically today in 2 Kings 7, verse 5. And it says, "And they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. And when they had come to the outskirts of the Syrian camp, to their surprise, no one was there." If we can just quickly bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, God, we thank you. We thank you so much for being a Father that loves and cares for us. That no matter who we are, no matter the mistakes, the doubts, the fears that we may have, that you still love us unconditionally. And Lord, as I'm about to just speak your words today, I pray that you cleanse me from any unrighteousness that I might have, and that the words I speak may be your words, and that your people who hear my voice, whether in person or online, will be blessed, knowing that they can walk with you without fear. All this I ask in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So fear, right? That's the theme of today's sermon. That is the title of today's sermon. Fear is something that we all can attest that we all have. Right? I know many of us here have fear of flying. During Christmas break, I encountered a person sitting next to me on the airplane who was terrified of flying. And I offered to hold their hand, and I quickly regretted it because it was 4 hours of sweaty palms. But this lady, she was nice, and so I kind of just tried my best to comfort her because her fear was starting to get me anxious also. So I kind of was like, hey, it's okay. It's going to be okay. Some people, might have a fear of water, fear of drowning, fear of many other things. Not too long ago, actually, I had a person who was afraid of escalators. It was weird. And I remember I was at Chinook Mall, and I was just going to go do my casual window shopping, and I was walking up, and this lady just stood there in front of the line, and I was like, are you going to go? Am I going to go? She's like, I'm just getting the courage to step on the escalator. And I was like, okay. So I walked in, and I was thinking in my mind, I'm like, oh, that's a thing. People are afraid of escalators. Now, we can go even a step further and say that some people here, or some people in general, have a fear of missing out. We term that as FOMO, fear of missing out. And I remember in college, that's one of my biggest things I had to learn how to overcome was fear of missing out. Everything's happening, and I'm here sitting in my room just studying my Bible. I'm like, I want to go there. I have some youth that talk to me about like Instagram is bad because I see what someone else is doing. I look at my life, and I'm like, I'm missing out. Fear of FOMO, fear of missing out, FOMO, is a real thing. Other people have fear of losing someone, right? And there's many fears out there, many phobias that we can all attest to. And one of the fears I want to share with all of you, out of the many fears that I have, is actually I have a fear of heights. Specifically, fear of falling from great heights. And it's funny because so my office, if those of you who do not know, is upstairs right at that corner over there. So if you have time during the week, feel free to knock on my door. I'll be there. But sometimes to go to the bathroom, I have to cross the pulpit, the pews up top. And I remember my first time being at the church, and I remember just like, all right, I want to see what the church is like. So I went upstairs, and I went to the corner over there somewhere, and I looked, and I remember I was like, wow, this is what it feels like to be up here. And then I looked down, I'm like, okay, never mind, I'm good. And it's not that high, if you can attest to, but it's just this weird innate feeling in myself of fear of heights and fear of falling. Now what's interesting too is I think my fear of heights is actually hereditary. I think I got that from my father. I'll tell you why, and my dad's probably going to watch this live stream, and he's going to be like, here we go again. But I'm going to share it anyway because I think it's a very interesting story. So not too long ago, my family and I, we went to the Philippines to visit some family, and we stayed there usually for a month. And, you know, for the first 2 weeks, you spend time traveling, and you go see family within the country. And then after a while, it's like, okay, we've seen everything, let's go explore. And one thing about being in Asia is that once you're there, it's cheaper to fly out to different parts of the world versus if you were to fly from here to go that place. So we decided, like, as a family, let's go explore outside of a place that we've never been to. Now, my mom, when she was younger, spent 2 years of her life at Singapore. And so we thought of, why don't, as a family, let's go look at Singapore. And so we went to Singapore, and I remember it was a wonderful time. We only spent about 2 days. 2 days there, one night. And we spent the whole time just exploring the city, my family, and some of my other relatives came with us. Now, what's even more amazing about this story is that we got to stay in this beautiful hotel. This is actually a hotel, if you see right here. Those 3 buildings, those are 3 different hotels, and on top is an infinity pool. And so there's a beautiful pool. They call it the Ark. I think it's called the Mariana Sands Hotel. You got to fact check me on that. I don't remember exactly. But it was beautiful. And of course, because it's so beautiful, it's also so expensive. And so what we did was that we got a hotel room with 1 bedroom, and we all squashed into it. You're laughing now, but imagine 10 people. 10 people in a room, just so that we have a sense of adventure, right? And I remember it was funny because luckily at that time my brother wasn't as tall as me yet, so we got to share the bed, like the floor space together. But now that my brother is taller, it would have been a different story. But I remember that night we came in early morning flight. We spent half the day exploring. We got on a bus, and we got to tour the different parts of Singapore. And if you ever get the chance to go to Singapore, if you've ever been there, it's so beautiful. Because you get to see the beautiful different cultures that influence the city, right? You have the people from India who've migrated there. You have people from China. You even have Filipinos everywhere. Filipinos are everywhere. But yeah, so you get to see just how much the city is hustling and bustling with different cultures, and I remember it was beautiful. And as we were going on this tour, the tour guide was advertising seeing Singapore from the skies. You see, in Singapore, they have this thing where it's like this beautiful gondola that goes pretty much around the entire city, and you get to see it in such a beautiful way. And I remember I look at my parents, and I'm like, we got to do this. We have to. When's the next time we're going to be able to be here? And so my mom agrees. My brother is like, let's go, let's do it. And you see my dad's face turn pale. He goes, okay, I'll wait for you here. Okay, you go, I will wait. I was like, Dad, come on. This is a time for us to just spend time together as a family, to explore, to see. And I remember this is when I was first getting into photography. And so I was like trying to take as much photos as I can. And I was like, please. And finally, my dad, after arguing with my mom, gets the courage to go. And so we step into the entrance, and we go into this gondola. The doors close, and it starts moving. Remember, me and my brother were sitting next to each other, and in front of me was my parents. And I'm just looking out the window, and I was like, wow, this is great. And my mom laughs at me because I'm only sitting in the entrance still. We haven't moved yet. And I was like, oh, this is great. But as soon as the thing starts moving, I start to kind of like, ooh, my heart starts to palpitate. Remember, I was like, okay, you know what? I gotta try to enjoy this as much as I can. But as I'm looking around, I see my dad, and he's sitting there, and he's just straight-faced looking at me. I was like, Dad, look, it's beautiful. He's like, mm-hmm. And so being the mischievous child that I am, I decided to add more to the thrill of this experience. And so I started rocking. Yeah, I started rocking the thing, and I was like laughing. My brother's like holding onto the window. He's like, please, stop. My dad's like, stop it. Stop. And I was like laughing or whatever. So I eventually stopped because I don't want to be in trouble inside a I think it was like 20-minute gondola ride. And so I stopped. And I remember I was just like, oh, this is great. And then all of a sudden, the gondola starts shaking. And it's because my mom, she's also, I get my mischievous side from her. She started playing a prank on us now. And she's like, yeah, you like that. How does that feel? I remember, I'm like, please, stop. And she's like, now you know what it feels like. Finally, the ride is over, and we got to see the beautiful skyline, and it was great. We come down, and I remember I was talking to my dad. I was like, Dad, why were you so afraid? And it's because, I asked that question because my dad would always tell me stories when he was younger. He used to work in Saudi Arabia, working on, these high skyscrapers, building these things. And I'm like, you worked in high environments, and you weren't afraid. And he's like, yeah, because I was getting paid. He's like, I paid to be on the gondola, not the other way around. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Finally, a few years later, my parents come to visit me in Calgary, and we go on the gondola ride again on Banff. Same thing happens. Exactly the same way. I scare my dad, same thing. We get to the top of Banff, and I asked my dad this question. I was like, why are you so afraid of gondola rides? They're safe. And he says something to me that till this day still resonates in my mind. He's like, he doesn't trust anything man made with his life. Whatever his being is, he can't trust it to someone else. And I was like, okay. I remember on the way to Banff, he was like, I'd rather walk up the mountain to get to the top than to ride this gondola because I trust God's creation more than the creation of man. And this is not just because my dad's trying to teach me a Bible story. He literally just said that. And I was like, okay, I'm going to keep that in my mind for maybe future sermons. But that thought resonated in my mind till this day. And it kind of made me question, at what point do I trust God versus the capabilities of myself? At what point do I trust God versus the capabilities of other men? And in that moment, the theme of fear really relayed on trust. And so I decided to kind of step into this realm of fear and see what it is. And according to the dictionary, fear is an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. Now, fear is nothing bad when you think about it. Being afraid isn't a bad thing all the time. In fact, fear is a God-made thing, right? Think about it. When you're afraid of something, it's usually because your body is telling you of potential danger. I know for me, whenever I'm standing on something high, my mind is telling me, hey, be careful, you might fall. My heart wants me to see the view, but my mind is protecting me because sometimes the heart can be deceitful. And so when you encounter moments of fear, moments of distress, uncertainty, our body reacts in many different ways, but two ways specifically is the fight and flight response. Some people, when they encounter a distressful situation, a moment of fear, a moment where they're afraid, their first instinct is, let me fight it. I don't know if you've ever experienced it, but I've seen in many movies that when people are walking in a dark alley and they're afraid, their first instinct is to clench up their fists and are vigilantly aware of their surroundings in hopes that if there's a potential danger, I'm ready to fight. Others, like myself, when it's a dark alley, I just run. I'm like, I have no time to stay here, I'm going to go. Another fear of mine actually is a fear of darkness. It's not because I'm afraid of the dark, I'm just afraid of something will pop out me at the dark. And I remember as a child, going to the basement was always scary. And so I remember I felt like a track star, where I would, as soon as I hit the light, I would sprint upstairs because I was just afraid. But our body reacts in that way. Either you fight or flight. However, there's also a third option that happens quite often, and it's actually freeze. So fight, flight, or freeze. Now, freeze is the most dangerous out of the three because in a difficult situation, what happens is that you get stuck there. You're caught in between the crossfire. Your fear holds you down that you end up just stuck. Now, there's nothing wrong with fear, like I said, but when you dwell in your fear and you allow your fear to control you, oftentimes you do not respond with a fight or flight. If you let your fear control you, what happens is that sometimes that fear will cause you to freeze. Our sermon starts in the story of 2 Kings, and just to give you a backstory of what's going on is that during this time, the people of Israel were going through some transitional periods with their relationship with God. And I say transitional because, as you know, if you read the story of the people of Israel, they have moments where they're here with God, and they're strong in their faith, and they're conquering nations. And then they have these transitional periods where they're like, I don't know who God is. I don't care for God. I want to do other things. And then they go back up, and they're like, we are the people of God. This story is one of those transitional stories. If you were to read 2 Kings in your own time, I encourage you to do so because it talks about a little bit more of the characteristics of the people of Israel at that time. You see, at the time, they didn't have good leaders that brought them to God. Instead, they had leaders that were just leaders of self. They wanted to grow more accolades. They wanted to be like other nations. They wanted to be better than other nations without actually allowing God to be in their presence. And one thing that God does in the stories is, if you know, is that God sends men and women of God to preach to them, to teach to them, to guide them back. And God would send prophets in the story. In our case, he sent prophet Elisha. Yet, even though these prophets, these teachers, these judges would come into the lives of the people of Israel, they still would not listen. And so God has to do drastic things to show them grander miracles in their lives, to really express to them that there is nothing more important in this world than a relationship with the Heavenly Father. And we're so blessed to have these stories because now we can look into the past and learn from our past, and in hopes that we can gain that and apply that into our lives. But they didn't have that back then, and so they just lived life as it came at them. And so 2 Kings goes on, and the story starts off with this king who is now being surrounded by enemy forces. They're in this city with fortified walls that kept them protected from the nations, but the army of the enemy was smart. And so what they did was they surrounded all entry points, whether it be land or by water, so that the people inside the city who think that the walls that they were in were meant to protect them are actually now prisoners within those walls. Because those walls are preventing them from experiencing or gaining the food that they need, the water that they rely on. And so what happens in the story is that people within those walls, the walls that were meant to protect them, are now imprisoning them, causing them to experience famine. And what's even more interesting is that now that the enemies are around, you can feel the tension of the people. You can feel that war is about to start. And so the people inside the city are now feeling anxious and worried, and they call unto their king because they, like many of us, rely on our leaders for guidance. But if the leaders themselves do not connect to the one that guides all people, that guidance is not complete. And so the story goes on in 2 Kings 7 verse 3, and you can read along with me. And it says, now there were 4 lepers at the entrance at the gate. And they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? We'll pause there for a minute just to give more reference. During the time of the people of Israel, they didn't have doctors and hospitals and medicine like we do now. During that time, because none of these technologies were invented, a lot of them died very quickly at a young age. And so to prevent them from experiencing more death, illnesses that were contagious were caused to be isolated. Ooh, many people heard isolation and they were like, you guys remember how that felt. But these people were isolated not because they were going through anything bad, but they were going through contagious illnesses, and the people did not want to get onto that, and so they were forced to live outside the walls of protection. They were cast out to live outside of the people of Israel. And so the story goes on that these individuals that are outside of these walls that were meant to protect them, are now in between the crossfire. And the story goes on in the verse continues in verse 4. It says, "If we say, we entered the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die. And if we sit here, we also die. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the enemies of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live. But if they kill us, we shall also die." We shall only die. Their options was to die, or to die. It was a lose-lose situation. Well, lose-lose-lose situation. And you can only imagine what it's like to be there. Think about it this way. These guys were already outcasts. In the minds of people, they were already considered dead. They had no more connection to the people they loved. They had no more connection to the city that they lived in. They were nobodies. And now they're in a situation where if they were to die, no one would care. And so they decided to risk it all. And they're like, what if we go there? If we survive, at least we would be prisoners. But prisoners, they have food. So why not? When I was reading the story, and I read the story before, I was reading the story again, it brought me to a time where, as a child, I would read the story and I was like, man, this story is powerful. Wow, this is great. But when I read it again today or recently, something hit me. Sometimes we experience being outcast. Sometimes we experience being put aside. Sometimes we feel like we're at rock bottom and we're stuck in a lose-lose-lose situation. And in moments like that, you can't help but sit there and complain. Why is this happening to me? Out of everyone, why is this going on to me? There could have been someone else that deserves way worse than I am. Why is it me? But sometimes, and this is where God really spoke to me when I read this text, and you'll see why. Sometimes when we hit rock bottom, it's not meant to take us out. It's not meant to destroy us, not meant to kill us, but sometimes rock bottom is forcing us to be on the lowest of our points, on our knees. And when we're on our knees, what else we can look at is up. Sometimes you are at your rock bottom because there is nowhere else to look at but up. Interestingly enough, as I was reading this story, it brought me to a time when I was a little bit younger, and I had to take care of my younger brother. My brother, he and I are 9 years apart, and if he's watching this, I'm sorry for telling our story, but I'll tell it anyway. We are 9 years apart, and because of our 9-year gap, oftentimes I'm stuck there babysitting him. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. But I remember this one time where I was feeding him, and it kind of, that lesson, that memory brought back to me, and it taught me something. I remember a time when I was feeding him, and I was feeding him like rice and some eggs or something, and I would scoop it and give it to him and eat it. This boy at that time was 3 years old, and he thought he was old enough to take care of himself, so he would always try to fight me for the spoon. So finally I let him take the spoon, and he started feeding himself. But as a child who doesn't understand how to feed himself, he would scoop, and he would try to aim for his mouth, and it would always fall onto his clothes. And he kept trying, and finally I look at him and I'm like, can I feed you now? And he finally gives me the spoon, and he gets what he needs. And it brought me to a time where I realized that sometimes when we try to do things on our own, in our own minds we think we're benefiting ourselves, when in reality we're causing a bigger mess. And that's why sometimes we hit this rock bottom. But sometimes, like a good parent or a good guardian, God allows us to experience this rock bottom, to stay there for a little while, only so that we recognize that the person that needs to feed us in the ways that we need is not ourselves, but rather the power of God. And so finally, when the people, the lepers, decide to let go of what they were going for, whatever mindset they had, when they decided to risk it all, The verse then continues, it says, "And they rose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians, and they had come to the outskirt of the Syrian camp. To their surprise, no one was there. You see, for the Lord had caused the army of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots, and at the noise of the horses, the noise of great armies. And so they said to one another, 'Look, the people of Israel have gained leverage over us. They had caused the Hittites and the Egyptians to come attack us.' And so they left." Sometimes God places us in moments of maximum fear so that we can receive the greatest blessing. God places the best things in life on the other side of maximum fear. And it's because, and obviously there might be other reasons, and this is from my own personal experience, but I feel like sometimes God allows me to go into these moments where I doubt, where I'm afraid, where I'm not sure, so that finally I can let go, knowing that I have no control of my life. Instead, I can just let go and let God. Now, letting go and letting God is kind of hard because you don't get to see the trajectory of where you're going. But that's where faith kicks in. When you let go and you take the step of faith, that's where you experience a blessing. The story then continues and says, "Therefore they rose and fled at the night." This is the Syrian camp. "And they left intact in their tents and their horses and so forth. The lepers then eventually go into the camp and they get their needs and more." Right? They were looking for food, and what did they leave with? Gold and silver and a full stomach, just as like I did when I came back from Christmas vacation. Sometimes when we allow ourselves to just trust in God and take that leap of faith, yes, that leap of faith is uncertain. Yes, that leap of faith is scary. But yes, when we take that leap of faith, God will give us what we need and more. Andrew's commentary says, "Upon deciding they had nothing to lose, by going to the enemy, they discovered the Lord's deliverance and became messengers of salvation to those who threatened them as outcasts." You see, one thing that really caught my eye in this story was if we go back to 2 Kings, notice when did the people of Syria leave their camp? What time of day? At twilight, right? They left at twilight. Now, if you don't know what twilight is, I had to search it up myself. It's not the movie for the teens here who've seen it. Twilight is a time of day where it's literally where the sun is about to go down or sun is about to rise to break the night or to break the darkness. So it's between sunset and sunrise. And so there's two different twilight moments. At least that's what I think that what Google was saying. But notice here, at twilight, the people of Syria left their camp. Let's go back a little bit further. Go back into our story. When did the lepers decide to go into camp? What time of day? At twilight. When the people who were suffering decided to let go and let God, it was at the moment of twilight. Going to the next part of our story, when the people of Syria left, they also left at twilight. I don't know if you're catching it, but what I'm seeing here is that when we decide, in the very moment that we decide to put our trust in God, God had already made the provision. When you take the step into trusting God, even though people around you say that is the worst idea you could possibly do, even though you have no certainty of what's to come, when you decide to trust in God, in that moment, God had already prepared your blessing. Y'all are not catching it. When we take our first step, we always imagine that God is walking with us, right? The song, Footprints in the Sand, is a common theme that we have, that God is with us as we walk. Though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I fear no evil, for what? God is with me. And we think of these things, that God is walking side by side. But one thing that the story is telling us, that even before we've already decided to take that step, the path was already made. All you had to do was trust. Do not let your fears take control of your faith. Do not let your doubts take control of who you are promised to be. Yes, it's okay to feel fearful. Yes, it's okay to have doubt. But to dwell in there, you do not either react in a flight or fight. You freeze. And when you freeze, you die. If the lepers in our story decided that, hey, we die here, we die there, we die here, might as well just stay where we are, we're going to die anyway, they would have missed the blessing that would have filled their stomachs and given them gold and silver more than they ever expected. If they had decided that day that, you know what, I'm going to die anyway, might as well just lay my head here, put my tombstone, and that's it, they would have not received the blessing. But they did. Whether they knew about God or not, they decided that they had nothing else better for them, and so they let go and decided to take the risk. And because they decided to take the risk, God had blessed them. And what's even more interesting, and I want you to read this in your own time, is that when they took the risk, they got what they needed and more. But what's even better is that God used them to free those people behind the walls of imprisonment. The people who were in the prison of the walls that they created with themselves, because they were afraid of their enemy, because they were afraid that they were going to be destroyed, because they were afraid they were going to die, because they didn't have the food, they let their fears settle in. They didn't realize that their enemy was no longer there. It wasn't until a few people stepped out in faith for their sake and received their blessing and was able to share it with others. God has placed you where you are because it is the start of where He eventually wants you to be. And if right now, I know we just started the year, the 14th. I know many of us have started making resolutions to start the year. I know for me, one of my resolutions is like, let's get rid of holiday weight. But sometimes, as we know, resolutions, it doesn't go as planned. How many of us here have already started and already failed our resolutions? Yeah. Hey, thank you for being honest. But you see, sometimes when things don't go our way, when things don't go in the manner that we think it should go, maybe it's not because you were doing something wrong. Maybe God is telling you, you are at the right place at the right time for what I want you to be. I always tell people when I'm about to preach a sermon that you could have been anywhere else. You could have been in a different church. You could have been at home watching online. You didn't even have to come to the church. But the fact that you hear my voice and you're in this place, whether virtually or in person, means that God wanted you to be here. He has a purpose for you. 2023 is the year that God is going to do great things in you. But you just need to step out in faith. The path has already been prepared for you. You just need to step out in faith. The way, the people, the things that you need to do are already prepared for you. You just need to step out in faith. And it's okay to walk in faith and still have doubts. But God tells us to lay them at His feet. For He can carry you. My favorite verse growing up, and I'm going to end off with this verse, is trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. Oftentimes when we think of us letting God direct our path, we're like, God, please guide me, please teach me, please mold me. But we forget the first part of that text, to not hold on to our own understanding, to let go and let God. This year, one of my personal resolutions, and I'm saying this in public because I think when you speak something in public, it's meant for you to keep yourself accountable as well as the people around you to keep you accountable. One thing of my resolutions this year is I want to start letting go and let God. And I mean that, and obviously in a more specific manner, but that's between me and God at that point. But I want you all to know that if I, as a leader, want to take this time and to start and to humble myself in the presence of God, knowing that I am not capable, only God is. I hope that that is a resolution that you can also take to heart. Because friends, God has promised us that when we trust in Him, our path is already prepared. And so as we separate from one another, I pray that this year, even if you've already failed, even if you've just started today, even if you're not sure to start, that this year, I pray, will be a year where you and God go a step further from where you started. That no matter what doubts, no matter what fears, addictions, problems you may face, and yes, it sounds too easy to be true, but if you just take the time to walk out on faith and trusting in the Lord, I am 100% sure God will open doors that you didn't even know were there for you. All you have to do is trust in Him. This is my prayer.